Hello, everybody. It's Brenda Howard, and this is Applied Occupational Theory. And our lecture today is on the person, environment, occupation, and person, environment, occupational performance, occupation-based models. So welcome to our lecture in a little bit of a different format than we usually have, and thank you for joining me in this way. So we have looked at several occupation-based models already this semester, and today we're going to look and compare two models that seem very similar at first glance, but have some pretty fundamental differences, and we'll talk about those. So when I first looked at PEO and PEOP, I thought, what? These two look very similar. They're talking about the very same concepts. Their names even sound the same. What are the differences between the two? And to add to the confusion with a little bit of the history of these models, they both have a great deal of influence from the Canadian model of occupational performance, which first came out in 1983. And this influenced both models greatly. Christensen and Baum were very much in communication with the authors of the CMOP and exchanged ideas on concepts over a great deal of time. And these concepts also ended up in the OT practice framework document as well. So interestingly, to make matters even more confusing, Law from the PEO and Baum from the PEOP have written together, and they've also written with Dunn from the EHP model. Christensen and Baum first published their model in 1991, and PEO first came out in 1996. And the interesting thing about PEO is that it was always intended to be a companion model to the CMOP. So that was always embedded in it. Down in the second part of the slide, you can see that I have listed the theorists for PEOP were Christensen and Baum, and also Julie Bass is sometimes added to that list. She has helped with some of the later editions of PEOP. And PEO theorists, there are a group of them: Law, Cooper, Strong, Stewart, Rigby, and Letts. And Mary Law is pretty much the lead on that team. So person, environment, occupation. This is where we're going to camp just a little bit here with the beginning of our lecture. And one of the things I want you to notice about the person, environment, occupation is that it is a lifespan, ongoing development perspective. So it's very much in coordination with a lifespan development perspective. It looks at life in cross sections of this ongoing trajectory of these arrows. And what it's looking at is at each particular point in time, how well are these three aspects of person, environment, and occupation fitting together? So it really looks at all three aspects at once. It doesn't separate them out in terms of occupational function. It says all three are coordinating together. And if any one of them is skewed in any way for any reason, that these items are not going to fit together. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Here's another rendition of it. And this one's kind of interesting because it's trying to show the 3D nature of the PEO model. So rather than just that static model that's kind of a slice, I think of it like you're making cookies and you have this cookie roll and you're slicing to make the cookies. Instead of just looking at that slice, we're looking at it now in 3 dimensions and seeing how the person and the environment and the occupation are all coordinating together and moving around each other to create that occupational performance, which is in the middle. And so it's a transactional model, which means that it's more complex than just interactional, meaning that at any given time, when one thing changes, everything else is changing. So in that way, it's kind of like the model of human occupation in that there's this hierarchical sense. They don't use that word in this model, but that's, if we were comparing it to the MOHO, that's one thing that we would look at, is that things all influence each other. It's happening all dynamically at the same time, and as one thing changes, other things change as well. For example, we've talked about this in relation to other models as well. Think about your morning routine, and if you change your environment, maybe you go to a hotel, maybe you stay at a relative's house, maybe you move to a different house or apartment, your routine has to change accordingly. You can't reach to the right for your toothbrush anymore. You have to reach to the left. So you get used to changing your routines, and you change your occupational performance, in particular, in that case, your habits, as a result. That's just a very simple example of the complexity of how these things influence each other. The interesting thing about the OT practice framework, looking at the PEO, is I think this section of the OT practice framework, where we're talking about the process and how all the different OT domains come together and create this process, um, looks like a lot like that PEO model. And I think there was some influence there. Now, of course, in the OT practice framework, instead of person, environment, and occupation, we have all the person characteristics in the middle, the client factors, performance skills, performance patterns, the occupations surrounding that in that sort of swirling ball. And then we have the context and environment encompassing that. So it's a little bit different take on the model, but kind of reminds me of OT practice framework domain. Now, one of the things you have to consider with PEO is that there is a fit. There are these, the circles will slide together to create a greater fit and slide apart to show a minimizing of the fit. And of course, that's supposed to be demonstrating or visualizing what happens in our life when the environment has a change and something moves out of the circle. Just from my own personal experience this week, as my basement got wet from all the extra rains, my environment has changed drastically. All the stuff that was in my basement is now going in my garage, and it has definitely changed my routines, and it's definitely changed where I'm putting my occupational energy, because I'm having to spend a lot more time in my basement doing household kinds of things than doing some of the work-related things that I would prefer to do. So again, that sense of everything impacts everything else, that transactional model happening. So some of the assumptions with PEO. There is certainly a client-centered focus, because it's all about the individual's interpretation. And one of the ways that we intervene with persons is in order to practice modifying all the different aspects of the person, the mind, the body, and the spiritual. In the environment, this model does refer to the fact that we're only looking at the environments or the context. They actually use those words interchangeably to look at where the occupation takes place. So we're not worried about all the environments everywhere. We're looking specifically at where this person conducts their occupations and that particular environment. And then there's a list there which looks similar to the client-centered model, the Canadian model, and also takes it. You remember when we talked about those concentric circles, where you have the person, the household, the neighborhood, and then the community. So it looks at an environment in that way as well. Occupation, we look at that as meeting the person's intrinsic needs for self-maintenance, expression, and fulfillment in the context of roles and environment. So again, a very broad definition. And it doesn't tell us whether the person is engaged in occupations by specifically doing, or can they observe? Can they be, directing a particular occupation? Another thing with PEO is that we have these nested concepts. And notice they flip the way that we looked at this in issues, that first comes activity, which is the basic unit of a task, like writing. A task is a set of purposeful activities, like you're writing a report. So there's some cognitive things that go on, and you might be collecting other things as well. An occupation is where you take a group of self-directed functional tasks and activities and put them together over the lifespan. So there's a sense of time. There's also a sense of goal-directedness as a part of that. And that has to do with then how that occupation translates into various roles. So as a student, you might be writing a paper for my class. But as a therapist, you might be writing a client report, a progress note, things like that. So we have these clusters of activities then that help us to maintain ourselves, to provide our own personal expression, and also to fulfill ourselves. And then I already mentioned that temporal aspect of occupation, both in terms of how long it takes to perform a particular occupation and how that occupation might change through the lifespan. So maybe cooking would be an example of that. When you were 10 years old, you might have cooked a few things. You might have used a microwave. But as you've gotten older, you probably have changed how you cook. Maybe you did a lot more processed foods when you were an undergraduate. things that are they're kind of ready made, ready to go. And hopefully by now you graduated to